Hi and welcome to another video. I was working on a project last week and I had a really interesting use case, and so I thought I'd share that with you guys. Basically, I needed to create a flow that would loop through a grouped set of records based on a criteria, add up a certain duration value of those records, and then check that against a custom metadata type to see whether or not that value exceeded the time that I had set out in my custom metadata type. And it was really interesting to be able to loop through these group set of records in a flow. So I decided to put together this quick demo to show you guys how I did that. Now, I will be going through the use case in a second, but before I do, this is the first flow demo video that I'm making, so I'd really appreciate your feedback. Just to let me know that I'm doing a good job and whether or not this is being helpful. Okay, so let's go through the use case together. This is a Trailhead playground, and I've created a couple of custom objects here. One of them is called timesheets, and this is a timesheet record. I have here in this timesheet record some very basic custom fields, such as a status pick list field, and we will use this in our flow as a trigger. We also have a validation message text field here, which we will want to populate if the timesheets need validation, and we have a date field as well. Now, the way this works is every day there will be one timesheet that represents all of the jobs for that day. Now, these jobs are captured in the related list under the timesheet entry. So we have three team members here: Brian, Emily, and James. And every time any one of these three team members starts a new job, they're going to create a timesheet entry and they're going to record the start time and the end time. After which, a formula field will calculate the difference between the start and end time to give us a duration in minutes. And then our flow will need to take all of the timesheet entry records per team member. This is the key bit: per team member. Add them all up, and if that total duration is greater than a custom metadata value that we've set out, then that's when we trigger our validation message. Okay, so for example, we have Brian here, and today it just so happens that Brian has three different timesheet entry records, but every day this will change. Sometimes Brian will have three, sometimes he will have more or less, and the same goes for every of the three team members. So today, Brian has three timesheet entry records. He started a job at 9:30 and finished at 11:30. So we have a formula field to calculate the duration of this job in minutes. And he's got another job at 12 that finished at 12:45, and a third job at 1:30 that finished at 2:15. So our flow will need to group these three records together, and for the time being, ignore all of the other timesheet entry records. It will group just these three records together. It will add the total duration in minutes of each record to create a total number of overall duration, and then it will compare that number with a custom metadata type. And if any of the team members for that particular day exceed that custom metadata value that we've set out, then we want to trigger that validation message on the parent timesheet record in this field here. So let's jump into the flow builder and let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and click on setup, and then we're going to search for flow, and then we're going to click new flow. Now we want this flow to trigger when the status it changes. So when the timesheet is submitted, so we create a record trigger flow. And then here we'll select our object, so timesheet. We only want this to fire when the record is updated, and then the condition will be that the status equals submitted. Cool. That is a good starting point. Now, some of the things that we're going to need to do first, we're going to have to get some of the records that we need information from in order for this to work. So we're going to need to get our custom metadata value to begin with. Then we're obviously going to have to get our timesheet, the parent record, and we're going to have to get the timesheet entry records as well. So let's start with the custom metadata. So I'll go ahead and get that. And I'm going to use some naming conventions here just to help me understand afterwards what it is that all of these different elements are doing. So custom metadata type. Now, if I can spell. And then here, my custom metadata type is called timesheet validation. And I don't need to have a criteria. I don't need to have a filter because I'm only getting, only one records exists. So I'm only getting that one record and I want to get all the fields in that record. Okay. So there we go. Now, next, what we want to do is we want to get our timesheet. So we want to get that. And here we want to select our timesheet object, and we want to make sure that this timesheet is the same record that trigger our flow. So here I'm just going to select our record ID just so that they can match. I don't need to sort this, and there's only going to be one record of this, so I'm pretty much done here. Okay. Now, next, what we want to do is we want to get our timesheet entries. Now, this is an interesting one. So I'm going to get timesheet entries. Actually, it's just called entry. Timesheet entry. Here we go. Here's a timesheet entry. Now, what I need to do here is I need to make sure that I'm only getting the timesheet entries that are related to my timesheet record. So here I'm going to select my timesheet master detail lookup field, and then here I'm going to select the timesheet from the previous get element that I've just created. So timesheet from get timesheet, and then here I'll select the ID value. Here we go. Now here I do want to sort this in ascending order, and I want to sort it by the member field. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that I'm looking at an organized list that's filtered by the member field in order before we start looping through records. And of course, there's going to be more than one record, so we're going to get all of the records and we're going to store all of the fields. So now that we have this in place, we can create our first loop. So here I want to loop through the timesheet entry record. So here's my loop, timesheet entry, and timesheet. So it's getting it, I'm going to loop through the record collection variable that I've just created. This is the one that I just created in the get element, so timesheet entry. And first to last is absolutely fine. We can go with that. Now, right after our loop, inside the loop, I'm going to add a decision. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because we only have 3 team members, so I don't really have to worry about limitations with the flow. This will be okay, but I do want to make sure that I'm not looping through people that I don't need to. In other words, if I've already looped through all of Brian's records, I don't want to have to loop through them again. I now want to exclude all of those records and loop through the next member's records. Otherwise, I'm just doing unnecessary loops here. So here's what I'm going to do. Here's a decision. So that's why I start with DES at the beginning. So I know that this is a decision. And let's call it does current member equals the looped member. And we can call this outcome yes. Now here we need to make a new resource. So we're going to go ahead and make a variable. So I'll call this variable current member. And I'll explain how this works in a minute. And I'm actually going to select this as a text variable. I'm going to leave everything blank and click done. I'll explain how this works in a minute, so no need to worry about that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the current loop item, and then I'm going to select here our member field. I'm going to rename the default outcome to no, just to make it look a little bit better and so I can understand what's happening when I look at my flow. So here we have our loop and our decision. Now inside the no path, I am going to create an assignment. And this assignment, I want to set the member and I want to reset the count. And again, I will explain how this works. And here what I want to do is I want to select the variable that holds the current member, and I want to make sure that this equals the current looped item. And then, so the variable current member needs to hold the current loop item member name. And then here we want to create a new resource, and this is what's going to hold the actual counter. So we need that counter to reset to 0 when we start looping new members. And again, you're going to see this in a minute. So variable duration counter, and here what we want to do, we want to select this as a number. All right, we can leave everything else as blank. And now I want to set this number to 0. So this is going to reset our count once they come through this path over here. Now, what I want to do is outside of the loop, I want to set another assignment. And this is where I want to set the duration for that counter. So here I want to select that variable duration counter, and I want to add the actual current loop item duration in minutes. So this is the formula field that calculates the duration in minutes between the start time and the end time. I want to add that duration in minutes into my counter variable. After that, I want to have another decision because I need to check whether that has exceeded our custom metadata value. So here's a decision, current duration above custom metadata question mark. And so if it is above, then a validation will be required. And so here I can select that variable duration counter. This is greater than our timesheet validation max time allowed. So this is our custom metadata value from our get element, and max time allowed is the field that I have that keeps a record of the maximum time. This is what I want to use to compare it with my variable. So I'm going to use that. I'll select that. And if validation is in fact required, then what I want to do is I want to update the actual record that triggered the flow. So here we have an update with a validation message. And then here what we want to do is we want to select the validation message field, and we're going to write just a text message. So member timesheet entry needs validation. Just going to select the message like that. Now, after this element, we're actually going to add an end element to our flow, because if it is triggered at least once, we don't need to check for the rest. Essentially, if it is triggered and the validation message is kicked off, then an end user will have to manually review all of them. So we don't really need the flow to keep going. We can stop the flow as it is. And so I'm just going to go ahead and hit save. And here we can say status, actually let's say timesheet, because that's the object. Status change to submitted. And let's save that. So let's have a look at our flow. What we're doing is we've got a record trigger flow that is triggered when the status is changed to submitted, or when the status equals submitted. Then we're getting our custom metadata type that holds the number that we're checking against. Then we're getting our timesheet. Then within that timesheet, we're getting all of the timesheet entries related to that timesheet. Then we're looping through all of those timesheets. And we're looping through, and then we're either resetting the counter and the variable that holds our team member value, or we're not, depending on the situation. And after that, we're setting the counter in this decision to our variable, so we can later use it in this decision to see whether the total amount has exceeded our custom metadata value or not. And if it has, we're triggering a record update with our validation message. And if it hasn't, then we simply go back to the top of our loop and we start looping the second member. So let's see if this works or not. I'm going to go ahead and hit debug, and I'm going to select our timesheet entry. Luckily, we only have one, so it's relatively easy to find. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the status to submitted so that we meet the criteria to actually trigger this flow. And then I'm going to hit run. So let's see here what's happened. On the debug details, this is really helpful to tell us what has actually happened in which order. So here we've gotten our timesheet entries and we are going to loop. Now, can you see here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different records. And this represents essentially this list here. We've got 6 timesheet entry records, and that's exactly what we're looping through. Now, the first decision is basically checking whether we have already looped through this, and we haven't. So this is the first time we're doing this. So then it goes to our assignment. Now this will assign, essentially it will reset our counter because we need that to start at 0, and it's going to assign our first member into our variable. So here you can see that our variable, the current member variable, now equals Brian because he is the first member that we're looping through, and our duration counter is starting at 0. Okay, now next we're going to go to the set duration counter. That's this element over here, and this will essentially take the first record and set the duration to 45 because this is the duration of his first record. Then it's going to decide, does this exceed the custom metadata type? It doesn't, so then it's going to loop again. And this is where it gets really interesting. We now need this loop to take the next record that belongs to Brian. This record can't be the same record that we've already looped, and it can't be a record that belongs to another team member. So let's see if that's working. So now we go through all the loops again. Well, now we go through the loop again that has all of the 6 records in it. But then the first decision, and this is where it's pretty key, the first decision is going to establish that the second record is Brian as well. And so instead of going through the no path and resetting everything, we're actually going to keep what we had already set, and then we're going to set the new duration counter on top of that. Now, the reason the second record that we're looping is Brian is because when we created the get timesheet entry element, we sorted the values that we're fetching through ascending order and the field member. So this is really important. So now here we have the second record from Brian. It has skipped that no outcome and it went straight to set duration. And as you can see, the set duration now is 90 minutes. And so we go through the same thing again. It goes through that decision to check if it exceeds. It doesn't, so it takes the third record from Brian. Here we can see we've got Brian for the third time, and it sets that duration again. And now that duration is 210. So it added every time we had a record from Brian, it took the duration from each record and it added it up. And then it checked against the custom metadata value. And because that didn't exceed the value that we have, then it didn't trigger the validation. Now, the fourth time we're looping through, this must not be a record from Brian. Otherwise, our flow doesn't work. So let's check. Okay, so this is our decision right after a loop. And now we're looping through Emily's record. So Brian has essentially, we've already looped through that. We don't need to loop through Brian anymore. So we're excluding Brian from our loops now. We're going through Emily. And so because it's the first time we're looping through Emily, we need to reset everything. So we reset our variable to Emily now instead of Brian, and we reset the duration counter to 0 so that Brian's values don't impact Emily. Now we check for that duration for this record. It's 60. We can see that right here. So we go through that decision. We don't need to trigger validation. We loop again. And for the second time now, we're getting Emily's second record. We then check for that and we add that duration to the counter. Because we don't need to reset Emily's variables yet, because we're not done with Emily just yet, then we just add that duration to the variable duration counter. It's now at 150. So then it checks for that validation. Again, it's not required. So now for the third time, we're taking another looped record, but now it's James because Emily only had 2 records. So now we're looping through James. So we reset that. Here is our reset assignment. We're now looking for James and the counter is back to 0 again. We then add that duration to the variable duration counter for James, and we checked against the decision. Again, it didn't exceed, so no validation required, and then our loop ends. So in order to check to see if it's really working, what we should really do is I'll take one of these records here. Let's say I'll take James because James is the last record that will be triggered or that will be looped rather in our flow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the start and end time to exceed our custom metadata value. So here, hopefully this time will exceed our custom metadata value. And then I'm going to debug this again, select the same record, select our trigger here to submit it, and then hit run. Okay, now we've got something a little bit different, but let's just go through this again really quickly. We're looping through the records again. We're making our first decision. Again, we're starting with Brian, so we're resetting everything to Brian and the counter to 0. We can see that right here. Then we're going to go through all of Brian's records. So he's got 3 records. This is one of them. This is the second record for Brian. Then this is the third record for Brian. And then when we make that decision, we don't trigger the validation because of Brian because he didn't exceed that custom metadata value. So then we loop again, and now we're looping through Emily. So here's Emily, and it's resetting the counter back to 0. She's got 2 records, so here's one of them. And then this would be the second record for her. And now we're looping through the third team member. So this is now James. So we've made a decision here. We're going to reset everything so we can go through James. And then we set that duration. That duration is 630. We check the decision. The decision actually finds that it is greater than a custom metadata type. And then we trigger that validation message. And so after that, the flow ends. So if I activate this now, because I have done some debugs and now I want to check on my actual front end, I've activated that flow, and I'll go ahead and hit refresh here on the front end of Salesforce. And so if I make this change in the status and I put submitted, we should get a validation message populated here. So let's check. And there it is. Member timesheet entry needs validation. So there you have it. We've created a flow whereby we are looking at a custom object and we're looking at the related list for timesheet entries, and we're grouping these related records by a specific criteria. In this case, we're using the member value. And then we are doing some form of calculation within those grouped records. And after we finish running those group records through our loop, we're ignoring that and running through the other records by a different group. Hopefully you find this video helpful. If you have any questions, please drop a comment down below, and until next time.